Thank you for joining us for this special session on the U.S. election, perspectives and prospects. Good morning in the U.S., good afternoon in Ireland if you're joining us from those different places. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at the National University of Ireland, Galway. Our seminar today is a collaboration between the Moore Institute and the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. And I'm grateful to Eileen Gillooly for this and for so many other previous chances to collaborate over the years. I also want to thank David Kelly, Digital Humanities Manager in the Moore Institute, who is providing the technical support behind the scenes. We've had 85 people sign up for the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. We invite your questions. There's a Q&A function, as you'll see, where you can contribute. We're also broadcasting live on the Moore Institute's Facebook page. I am delighted to be joined by an excellent panel, and I'm going to introduce them now in the order in which they will speak. Stephanie McCurry is the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of American History in honor of Dwight D. Eisenhower at Columbia University. She's an historian of the 19th century United States, the American Civil War and Reconstruction, and the history of women and gender. Her current work focuses on Reconstruction in the US and the comparative history of post-war societies and processes of Reconstruction in the 19th and 20th centuries. Stephanie is the author of 3 books, Masters of Small Worlds, Yeoman Households, Gender Relations, and the Political Culture of the Antebellum South Carolina Low Country, 1995, Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South, 2010, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Women's War, Fighting and Surviving in the American Civil War, 2019. She was born in Belfast and now lives in New York City. Josef Sorett is Professor of Religion and African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. He is the chair of the Department of Religion and directs the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. His work takes an historical and literary approach to the study of religion in Black communities and cultures in the United States. Josef published his Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics with Oxford in 2016. His second book, The Holy, Holy Black, The Ironies of an African-American Secular, is forthcoming, also with Oxford. He's editor of an anthology tentatively entitled The Sexual Politics of Black Churches. He has held grants from a number of foundations, including the Henry Luce Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and Yale University's Institute for Sacred Music. And he's also appeared in a range of popular media outlets, including ABC News, the HuffPost, New York Times, the Washington Post, as well as on the BBC and NPR. Eileen Gillooly directs the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities, as I mentioned, at Columbia University. She's on the faculty in English and Comparative Literature, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Institute for Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her work as a center director has led in recent years to partnerships with other centers and institutions on projects that promote public engagement and public scholarship. Eileen is the author or editor of 5 books, including the award-winning Smile of Discontent, Humor, Gender, and 19th Century British Fiction. She is currently a principal investigator on the Mellon Foundation-funded Justice in Education Initiative, which aims to increase tertiary educational opportunities for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. Charlotte McIvor is a senior lecturer in drama and theater studies at the National University of Ireland, Galway. She is the author of Migration and Performance in Contemporary Ireland Towards a New Interculturalism, and the co-editor of a number of books, The Methuen Companion to Interculturalism and Performance, Interculturalism and Performance Now, New Directions, Devised Performance in Irish Theatre, Histories and Contemporary Practice, and Staging Intercultural Ireland, Plays and Practitioner Perspectives. She's published in a range of journals and edited collections. She is also a theater and creative arts practitioner, and her most recent work is with NUI Galway's Active Consent program, which she is directing the creative arts and communications unit for that project. And in 2019, she directed and produced Active Consent's inaugural nationwide third-level theater tour, The Kinds of Sex You Might Have in College, which is an original play she co-devised with students featuring a company of professional alumni actors. Stephanie, I'd like to start with you, and thank you very much for joining us. Very much looking forward to your take on this interesting and challenging moment.
Well, good morning, everybody. Should I just start? I can't tell from the camera whether we're already running.
Please do. Yep.
Okay. Terrific. Well, good morning, everybody from New York, where we're in our third day of anxious waiting to know exactly what our political future here in the United States is. Just to remind those of you who are joining us, because I'm the first speaker, let me just tell you what the state of play is at this particular moment. Check your phones for updates as we meet today. At this particular moment, Joe Biden is winning, the Democratic candidate is winning the popular vote by about 3 million votes. And as we all now know to pay attention to, the Electoral College, he has currently got 253 votes to Trump's 214, and he needs 270 to win. There are decisions, or at least information, coming in this morning from Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, possibly Pennsylvania, which should settle this, but it's been a long 3 days. So let me tell you, let me just speak a little bit quickly about my own reaction or my own sense of where we are at the moment. And it has to do with a reminder of the size, complexity, and divisiveness of the United States as a country. I mean, this is a population of 328 million people spread over 3 time zones and an enormous landmass and diversity. And to this moment, something like 150 or 160 million votes have been cast in this election. So it's a really hard thing to get your mind around. And at this particular moment, it looks unlike Tuesday, it looks like Biden is likely to win. And that will bring an enormous sense of relief to those of us on the coasts and in Democratic dominated areas who have suffered under Trump's regime in the last 4 years. But that's not actually what I want to talk about, because I think what I've been thinking about, and a lot of people have been thinking about in the last few days, is, as Jamel Bowie put it in the Times this morning, that if we thought we were going to get a repudiation of Trumpism, we didn't get it. And that has been, I mean, Tuesday was painful watching that vote come in, but it's also just really sobering, a reminder of how divided this country is. Last time Trump won about 48, Trump at this moment, I think, has won about 48% of the popular vote. He actually won about 5 million more votes this time than he did in 2016. So how are you supposed to understand that? It's very difficult. That's what polarization means. It's hard. There's a gulf of comprehension even between the Democratic voter and the Republican voter. We watched this campaign play out. It was just crazy. I mean, he played to his base, sticking to his gut as he always do. We asked ourselves, how could that possibly work? And the crushing recognition is that it did. And so we have to figure out yet again what that's all about. What is it that people are responding to with such fervor? I mean, I voted very enthusiastically for the Democratic candidate, but some Trump voters love Trump. There's a cult of personality here. And given how offensive that personality and political performance is to half or more than half of Americans, it's very difficult to understand what that's all about. He goes out on those rallies and he talks trash like some street fighter, and it works. So that's where the divide is most apparent. And what is it about? Okay, I'm a historian, as Dan said, of the 19th century United States. Whether you're a historian of the 19th or 20th century United States, you don't need many reminders about the power of the racial divide in American history. Nationalism, as in parts of Europe, are a key element of Trump's appeal. And this, of course, in our country is white nationalism. We know this, it's shocking nonetheless. In other words, there's a straight line from Charlottesville and the race baiting and the torch bearing, the Klan level activity there, to the divisiveness and thin edge of this electoral outcome. So this is not new, but it's shocking nonetheless. And I would mention 2 other things. First of all, patriarchal power. This macho bullshit has always been inseparable from the white nationalist, white supremacist politics and posture and political culture. Slaveholders in the United States were masters. They were masters of dependent people, and their identity was built around it. This macho posture of honor in the 19th century, the version we get now, it has always enhanced, white nationalism and its claims always enhanced the power of men, of white men, and encourage that style of dominance that we see so evident here. And one of the upsetting things that we are learning in the last few days is that Trump has increased his share of the vote from Black men, which seems quite unbelievable, and Latinos, who are a very complicated population in the United States politically, but which there is Latino men especially seem to be drawn to the Trumpism and Republicanism. But also white college-educated men, okay? Underscore that one. So here we are. This is not just about class. It is not just about race. This is also about male power, and a kind of aggrieved masculinity runs underneath all of this. So I think that that's one of the, I guess, the most important thing that I'm thinking about is this divide, what it's about, the polarization. You know, when we look at the other side of the divide, there's good news. I mean, there's a lot of racial allyship going on. There's a lot of support around women leaders emerging, although when they're in the top position, that becomes a no-go zone in the United States. There's some very good news here. Trump is likely to lose. Some states have swung into the Democratic column. For people in Georgia have been working like crazy to make this happen over a number of election cycles. This might actually be it. Arizona, same thing. And there are energetic progressives everywhere and young progressives coming in with interesting programs. And so there's reasons for hope. But and of course, the fact that Trump would, if he loses, will be a first-term president. And the loser label I would love to affix to him. So I guess I'll leave it there just to say that the news might be good. We hang on the vote call every hour, but whoever wins, we have an incredibly divided country, and the sources of that division are deeply troubling.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's a wonderfully compressed account of where we are at the moment. Yeah, just to pick up on one thing which we can come back to, I think there's an interesting question about how African Americans who have supported Biden, if he's successful, how they'd be rewarded. And one thinks particularly, I guess, of what's going on in Georgia as a possible model. But Josef, I wonder if I could come to you now and ask you for your thoughts on this election.
Thank you, Dan, for the invitation to participate in this conversation, as well as to my colleagues on the panel. I'm very much glad to be here to participate in this conversation and look forward to what follows. I'll try to keep my remarks brief. And on one hand, I am very much interested in what Dan has posed around sort of how African Americans figure as a key block, if you will, as in the sort of electoral campaign, but also the degree to which race and religion. I guess I very much appreciate Professor McCurry's comments in framing our conversation, moving us forward and thinking about the degree to which questions of race, questions of gender, questions of nation are very much central to the ways in which Trump, as much as it doesn't always lend itself to a coherent speech, if you will, performs, right? A sort of affective performance of the nation's investment in a particular white male vision of the nation. And I think what I would want to say, and this is, I think, both in flashing back to what folks wanted to appear surprised about prior to his election the first time, to where we are now and to where things might go, is this sort of what seemed to some to be an uneasy or surprising alliance between evangelicals, right? And not to conflate evangelicals and a religious right, which were aligned in terms of their investment in Republican politics with a particular set of values that were often framed as family values, such that the easy alignment that seemed to appear in Trump's first campaign surprised folks, that here was a candidate who seemed to be an affront to all the values that evangelicals and folks on the right were understood and professed to be aligned with, right? And one of the responses or interpretations was that, okay, now religious professed commitments were being unmasked for what they were, and that was an investment in a particular vision of the nation as grounded in male authority, as grounded in whiteness. And Trump, even when he could not find himself to quote a passage of the Bible in a way that made sense, was able to conjure a vision of white masculinity that aligned well with the affective dispositions of evangelicalism, right? We can see the ways in which that has transformed, even in more recent protests, as he walked to stand in front of an Episcopal church in DC. We can recall as folks were knocked to the side and injured as he went to get a soundbite and an image in front of the Episcopal Church, which was heartily, encouragingly refuted and rejected by the leaders of that church, right? So there's a suggestion that perhaps and hopefully we will have a more strident critique from a religious perspective that is aligned with the more progressive vision of the nation and the kinds of interracial alliances that Professor McCurry cited as something that is emerging in this moment. But one might ask where things will go, especially as we think about the different configurations of race and religion. What is it, right? Even within the context of, say, the different Latino communities in Florida, right? As that's often associated with a particular kind of evangelicalism, and how does religion matter in thinking about the different kind of Latino community in Arizona that has moved that vote in a different direction, or then, right, is what is perhaps the most customary and expected image of race and religion configured, grounded in a place like Atlanta, which of course was the base for Congressman John Lewis, which was of course the home of Martin Luther King Jr. before him, and the degree to which, right, the Democratic Party, as the person running, right, on the special ballot to replace John Lewis, is himself also someone in that tradition, Robert Franklin, the degree to which there might be a space to open up a different kind of conversation about race and religion and Christianity that is part of this long history that finds Christianity on either side of a values war, on either side of a set of racial divisions, that perhaps this election, as it unfolds, might provide a space for a different kind of conversation around the degree to which Christianity shapes not only a conversation about race, but also in thinking about Christianity as not just something that the Republican Party or the religious right has the corner of the market on, that we might in fact move into a different space for thinking about how religion shapes the kind of values we profess or do not profess, and the ways in which it maps onto or fails to map onto electoral politics. So I'll stop there. Very much look forward to hearing from my colleagues and to the conversation with everyone. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, a lot of very interesting things to follow up on. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back to lots of things. Eileen, over to you now for your thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to take a slightly different angle on this, and over the last couple of days, I've been reflecting on the fragility of democracies, I suppose is the best way to put it. So the political scientist Larry Diamond wrote in the New York Times over the weekend that in order for democracies to function, they must adhere to 3 different principles or beliefs. One is the rule of law. The second is an independent judiciary. And the third is the integrity of elections, right? And Trump's strategy has been from the beginning to undermine all 3 of those principles. The US is the oldest democracy in the modern era, as we know, and despite its, seems to me, catastrophic loss of esteem in the eyes of the world over the last 4 years, democracies everywhere, and not just democracies, follow US politics closely because of its global impact. And there was a headline in yesterday's Washington Post, I think, that put it well. It reads, "Election cliffhanger transfixes world, fuels fears in Europe for fate of US democracy." as well as I'd say as fears for their own political situations, because if this could happen in the US, then what does that mean for the rest of us? So maybe it's because I'm hyper alert at the moment to the QAnon phenomenon, but I have to say I am worried about the integrity of this election. If Trump supporters are willing to inject bleach, block bridges, show up with guns at polling places, liberate Michigan, the list goes on, simply because Trump tells them to do so, tweets for them to do it, it seems to me extremely unlikely that they would not also follow his repeated suggestion to test the system by voting twice. He kept saying over and over, both by mail and vote in person to see, to see if the system works, especially because he keeps saying this in the context of complaining that the system is rigged against him, right? This is before one vote was cast. So I just want to be clear, I'm not alleging that such a double voting did in fact occur, simply that it's more probable that it did than injecting bleach or believing that there's a cabal of Democratic and Hollywood elites that are drinking the blood of children, is QAnon would have us believe. And we're about to send our first congresswoman who's a QAnon believer. Will join the House of Representatives in January. And the idea of double voting would certainly help to explain a little bit the much larger than expected number of Trump voters this cycle. As Stephanie pointed out, there were 5 million more people who voted for Trump, which seemed surprising to us because we know, and Trump admits, that he actually lost the support of suburban white women this time, as well as the newest crop of voters, these 18 to 22-year-olds who are voting for the first time, vote overwhelmingly Democratic. You know, the LA Times said today, you know, they were sort of befuddled by the fact that the Republicans succeeded in finding and turning out unprecedented numbers of rural voters. Like, the whole idea is that there are not supposed to be that many people who live in those areas. So that's that aside. The third point I kind of want to make is to sort of reiterate what Stephanie told us or reminded us about a divided nation, which we are, you know, whether we're as divided as we were at the start between loyalists and revolutionaries, or in the 1850s and 60s between Unionists and Confederates, is yet to be seen. But no matter how much Trump wants to frame it as such, the division is not between populists and elites, nor has populism in the US always been right-wing, right? Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party was populist, as is the so-called socialist wing of the Democratic Party that Bernie Sanders leads. One of the many challenges we're facing right now is how to direct populist energy, or to pick up Josef's point, basically evangelical values, and direct them into policies like the right to healthcare or a living wage. So sort of FDR type recovery acts, rather than let it foment, it seems to me it is doing now, xenophobia and conspiracy theories like QAnon. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Eileen. I'm reminded of that line, and Stephanie could probably gloss it, attributed to Ben Franklin, about a republic if you can keep it, the fragility of democracies, as you noted. Charlotte, could I turn to you now and invite you to give us your thoughts?
So hello, everyone. Thanks. It's amazing to be in such illustrious company, and also to hear the thoughts of my colleagues still on the ground over there in the States. I'm speaking to you here as an expat now of more than 8 years full time. And I was really struck by Stephanie beginning with talking about the diversity and the size of the US, which is something I've been reflecting on a lot the past couple of days. But I'm going to begin my brief remarks actually with a quote from social media before turning maybe to speak to social media in a couple minutes. And I saw this last night on my Instagram, which is populated activists, with Democratic candidates, with sexual health and wellness people. You know, it's a typical left-wing academic Instagram. But this quote really jumped out to me, and it was, "Racism is not the shark, it's the water." And I would add to that also, misogyny is not the shark, it's the water. You know, it's not just about Donald Trump, but the voting patterns that we have seen over the last 2 election cycles, you know, have shown us that there is a longer and a deeper context and a recalcitrance and an emboldening of certain kinds of, I suppose, attitudes, and how those attitudes around race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and on are tied into as well our dependence on and our obsession and our romance with capitalism, often against factual or logical grounds within the US in my own experience. But before I get to social media more broadly, I'm going to bring it back to myself, because my own relationship to politics is very much shaped by the family that I grew up in. The research that I do is shaped to the family that I grew up in. And I grew up in a pretty far-right family in Northeast Philadelphia, Irish, German, American descent, virulently, proudly conservative, listening to Rush Limbaugh since he went on the air. He went on the air in the late 80s. We had him on speed dial by the early 90s. So for me, this election is both showing us that we're in the water. This is not something that has turned on a dime, but rooted in particularly a neoconservative movement from the 70s onward. This has been a long game that is playing out now in key moments of the presidency, such as Limbaugh getting the Congressional Medal of Freedom, a really emotional moment for me because I was so angry, and it showed me the way in which the kind of hate and vitriol that I grew up listening to now has reached a kind of culmination in this moment. You know, there's been some really interesting research done in the field of cognitive science about the way in which our brains are shaped and process information in relationship to our political identity or our political beliefs, filtering out information that we don't want to hear. And that certainly has been my own experience growing up, watching my parents and other family members vote actively against their issues again and again, and the kind of emotion and the anger there, the othering of others, and so on. So there's something going on there. And I think that, you know, we look at the legacy of the Electoral College rooted in the issue of slavery in the 19th century. We look at the way in which the emboldening of a figure like Trump, who, as I think Stephanie also said so well, you know, that romance of the strong man, of someone just coming out and saying it like it is, you know, that is part of the so-called, I think, American character. So there's been an emboldening and a really the lowering of the bar in terms of tolerance or empathy towards what we see committed right in front of us. And I think, you know, I imagine, you know, if whether this goes the right or the wrong way, in my opinion, people may talk about, you know, is the language the Democrats are using too soft when they talk about the soul of the nation, when they talk about togetherness? You know, this was some of the stuff that was lobbied against Hillary Clinton in 2016. But my perspective will be that we need to hold on to that language against this wave of ugliness coming towards us, because it has been there, and the water, I suppose, is getting, as I said, emboldened in what is happening. And I think we can't ignore the very obvious role that social media, the change in the ways that we get the news, the role of targeted advertising, the intensification of people in their devices in their homes during the coronavirus epidemic. You know, we're looking at a totally different way in which elections are taught, in which affect plays out, or people's worlds are closed in around them in 2020. And I don't think that we've gotten to grips with that as a culture or as a news media even yet. Coming back as well to this theme of that it's not the shark, it's not Donald Trump, it's the water. I think that we need to keep in mind, you know, especially with the size of the country, the historical embeddedness and background of the kind of issues coming up here, that social work is long-term hard work. You know, we live in, you know, Donald Trump has made the world in which we live in, I suppose, and his Trumpism seem more reactive than ever. But the battle to say keep Roe v. Wade on the books, of course, has been going on for decades and decades, and now is under the greatest threat that it's ever been, you know, and things that used to reassure, I suppose, a more general populace that, poll after poll has shown, oh, well, the majority of people would not be so radical as to want to strike that down. It was 66%, I think, across party lines of people wanted to keep Roe v. Wade on the books. But when the moment came up, Trump even has struck at that with the appointing of Amy Coney Barrett. People still have turned the other way, right? So the terms of these fights keep changing. We have to be in it for the long haul. I would point as another moment to the murder of George Floyd and how progressives, we say over and over again, this is the moment. People cannot turn away anymore. We're heading in the right direction. And I believe we're heading in the right direction. Whether that right direction is to a destination, I don't think that it is, because we say, people will pay attention, people will not turn away now. People are still turning away. We've seen them turn away at the polls. So I think that it really is, to quote Lauren Berlant, we need to be in this for the long haul. We need to make no mistake that racism is not the shark, it's the water. Misogyny is not the shark, it's the water. So how do we strike at those roots? Through how we communicate, how we talk across party lines, across such a big country. I don't know, but I think this link between identity, politics, and what we're willing to turn away from or turn toward, we need to do a lot more deep thinking and meditation on that as a nation, and let that shape our future political strategies. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Right, I guess if you could all turn your cameras back on, we'll start the question session side of it. And again, invitation to those attending to provide us with questions through the Q&A. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a number of things that we've discussed. And the first thing I wanted to ask, and maybe just coming back to Stephanie, you made those interesting comments about, Trump and certain forms of masculinity. I wonder if you might comment a little bit, and others might want to come in on this, about Biden's version of masculinity. I mean, there's such a overt contrast being offered to us. How do you think that's played, and how would you characterize it?
Well, it's hard not to think about Hillary Clinton. So we can talk about, competing forms of masculinity, but I think the important thing is that it's masculinity. This is the elephant in the room. So, and it's really infuriating. I mean, it's just, how do we ever escape this level of diminishment of female humanity? Okay, separate subject. Well, no, not separate. Absolutely related subject. But who's Joe Biden? Uncle Joe, right? Joe Biden is the Irish Catholic father figure, which from my point of view isn't necessarily always the gentle guy, by the way, but that's his version. The guy who calls his grandkids every day, who gives everybody a hug, who goes to church, who's wounded and living in grief, basically. So there's a distinct contrast. He wears the skinny suit, the skinny European suit, not the strong man suit. Like Charlotte's rightly, asking us to train our attention on the optics and the emotions of all of this. Trump's the overweight guy, anyway, whatever. I mean, it goes on and on, but I think, what you have here is a kind of a version of liberal masculinity that young progressives, I don't think particularly relate to. There's a lot of macho stuff going down among young male progressives as well, the bro culture. So I don't necessarily think it, and a very social media aggressiveness on the part of those kind of guys. So Biden's a bit of a throwback, I'm not really sure. And I think this is part of the challenge here is that, if Biden actually becomes president, all of us Democrats will be enormously relieved so that we don't have to deal with Trump in our heads every day. But I don't think Joe Biden inspires the kind of cult-like following or ever would. And the kind of masculinity he embraces is more tolerable to thinking women. But we can't underestimate, and I suspect other panelists would have interesting things to say about the appeal of that macho, bullying masculine style to women. That mystifies me, but it's real.
And on that, Stephanie, I mean, something that I've been really interested to look to see is the kind of turn against Biden, particularly of young progressives. And of course, that has to do with his record, that has to do with his more centrist politics. But you think back a few years ago to during the Biden campaign, and as like the lovable sidekick with his ice cream and his dog, like he was very popular to the point where there was the running joke on Parks and Recreation about the character Leslie Knope, being in love with him and him being her model and, saying, I want you to have, the brains of Tom Hanks and the body of Joe Biden, right? And that, and then I'm like, well, yeah, that's my demographic. So maybe that makes sense to me, but maybe not to the younger people. But there seemed to be a real kind of turning against that I found very, very interesting.
Yeah, fascinating observation about the European suit. I must admit, I hadn't spotted that, but you're absolutely right. All of these signifiers that communicate in such powerful ways. I mean, just on this topic, Eileen, I wonder if do you think, obviously we have Kamala Harris on the ticket with Biden. Do you think the prospects of a female president have become less likely or more likely through this campaign?
So I think that when Biden was trying to pick a running mate, and he said he was going to pick a woman, right? And there were maybe a dozen people whose names came up. But I think it was important for him to pick a Black woman. I mean, I think that was, and it wasn't simply playing identity politics. I think it's easier, and Stephanie and I have talked about this sort of, just conversationally. I think it's easier in this country to accept a Black woman in a position, especially as vice president, than it would have been, than it was for Hillary Clinton. I think the misogyny is strongest by white men towards white women. So I think that in Kamala Harris has also been, I don't know, she's nobody's fool. She was nobody's wife. She wasn't, all the things that sort of, people said against Hillary Clinton can't sort of apply to her. Yeah. So I suppose I do think that if God willing, she's in that role, then it will be easier for her to run, if she wants to. Biden said he would only be a one-term president, and she would be the lucky candidate. Yeah,
very interesting to get your take on that. Josef, I wonder if I could come back to the issue of religion specifically, because it's such a significant one. And there obviously are problems for the country, given that the United States is a very religious country. So if you then have a situation in which religion is being co-opted by one party, if that's the right way to put it, then you have a difficulty. I mean, obviously we've been told about, and there's been a certain degree of emphasis on Biden's Catholicism. We have the Supreme Court being overwhelmingly Catholic and conservative, which is rather striking. Well, Sonia Sotomayor, I presume, is Catholic, but would be, on the other side. I was also struck by, I guess I'm thinking back to Hillary Clinton. To me, I think that there was a kind of a cultural Methodism, I think, to her background, so that there's actually a religious informing aspect to that experience, but there was not a way to articulate it. So that's a rather long lead into a question to you, but I just wondered if you could.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. And at first, I just wanted to say quickly, right, I agree with Eileen's assessment. And even in the face of that, right, the Republicans have tried to latch on and otherize Trump by tapping into that racial and misogynistic rhetoric by foregrounding Kamala, right, on the ticket, right? And we might wonder about what role that has played in sort of upping some of the investment in Trump in the numbers in the election. I think in terms of the religious question, what's fascinating on the left is to see from, say, go back from Biden to Clinton, but even before that to Carey, and the sort of constant concern that the left and that the Democrats don't get religion, right? And so to see Biden speak about his own faith is, right, drastically different than Carey all of a sudden conjuring up his own Catholicism. If we think of John, right, doing that now, what, I guess 15, 16 years ago. But then I think this also speaks to Stephanie's point in terms of sort of the investment in a particular performance of masculinity that's appealing to both men and women, right? That the sort of alliance between gender and religion, in this case, right, Clinton's Hillary Clinton's cultural Methodism was not as like powerful as the sort of soft Catholicism that's aligned with even a different kind of masculinity in the case of Biden. And I think one further thing, right, to think about Catholicism that's circulating across the last couple of weeks, right, this sort of evangelical piece or even Pentecostal piece is to think about the Catholicism of Biden in contrast to the Catholicism of Amy Coney Barrett, which again, then is aligned with a particular set of gender politics, even the woman who was professing this Catholicism. So there's, I think there's certainly a space in which the left has to still do more to create a different kind of conversation about how we think about religion, because we still very much are stuck within a frame that is the product of the religious rights domination of the media that provides the discourse in which we think about religion in the current moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also that sense of we've evacuated the idea of a social mission of Christianity. I mean, that's historically significant if we certainly go back to the 1960s, but that's so impoverishing for the country. And it was interesting you're mentioning, in relation to in relation to John Lewis and Robert Franklin. I mean, obviously there's traditions there and an understanding that it has a particular force in the Black community, but it ought to have a wider force too. I think that there's potentially something to be drawn on there.
I think that's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Eileen, you wanted to come in on that?
I just wanted to jump in about, it has to do with the power of religion at different moments in time. Evangelicals were basically abolitionists, right? I mean, all that, right? And so this very socially progressive, right? Love thy neighbor kind of thing. So how it's like upended is curious. And I'm not sure if, Josef, you have an idea about it, except that it seems, the whiteness of it seems to be fairly strong at this point. But.
Well, most evangelicals were not abolitionists. Abolitionists were Quakers and Universalists. Most evangelicals, white evangelicals who were not enslaved in the South were deeply pro-slavery. It's a really long-standing problem. So yeah, there's this progressive, liberal kind of Protestantism, but evangelicalism has mostly not been that. White evangelicalism, sorry, of course, Black evangelicalism has always been another thing entirely.
Right, and I think that's like if we think back of like the Great Awakenings or the revivals of the 19th century, like that evangelicalism is flowing both ways, right? It's seen as a promise of democracy, but then it's also what gives rise to a sort of religion of the lost cause, the sort of evangelicalism as this sort of broad category. I think, in fact, we have to be more precise and think about the ways it has taken shape, because when we think about even the religious right, if we go back to the 60s or what have you, it's often a narrative tied to Roe v. Wade. But if we jump a decade earlier, it's actually Brown v. Board that is galvanizing that religious right as they're forming segregated schools in the South, which are called Christian academies. What are they? They're white supremacist schools, right? And so that all this is often not part of the conversation. I think that historians' precision is needed in to bring up, to think about religion as well.
Thanks. We've had lots of interesting questions coming in, and I wanted to begin with one which is asked to Charlotte specifically from Owen Gubbins-Cloney, who says, does Charlotte think Irish Americans tend to be more Democratic or Republican, or is it just purely down to geography? So a few choices being offered, but what's your take on that, Charlotte?
Well, I suppose just speaking from personal experience, I remember being so surprised when I heard that most Catholics tended Democrat, because I grew up with the sense that Catholics were very much Republican. And a lot of it came down to the abortion issue, particularly in my own family and the emotion around that. I was watching the TV show Mrs. America, which begins with Phyllis Schlafly and her coming face to face with the feminist movement, and recognized a lot of the rhetoric that she was using and things that my mother, that I said to me, that I had heard in my community growing up. So I think that there are some Catholics who'd be very much within the pro-life so-called movement and align there, but there's a broader picture of Catholics, people who may be more tuned into the liberation theology union side of Catholicism, but those were not my people. My people were the other kind of Catholics.
Yes, and you even use that phrase, my people, which to me is a very Irish sort of thing. I first became adjusted to it over here. I didn't realize I had people, but I kept being asked who my people were to figure that out. Other questions are coming in, and I don't know who might like to respond to this, but in 2024, Tom Ford asked, is there a chance of AOC running against the next Republican candidate? Well, that's interesting. Does anybody have a view on whether AOC is going to be in the mix? The sort of group she's associated with were all reelected, which is interesting in itself, but she remains obviously a very significant figure and an interesting challenge, I think, in a variety of different ways. Obviously a challenge to the right, but also a challenge within the Democratic Party. Yeah, Stephanie, did you want to respond to that?
I mean, I don't have, it's a great question. And my immediate thought is my brother thinks so. My brother worships this woman. He thinks that she is the most gifted, naturally gifted politician in a couple of generations. And every time I hear her, whether it's in a dance video or a tweet, it's so true. I mean, she has the perfect tone and posture for social media communication, but she's a serious politician. And so I think it's a little early to answer that question, but I think we'll know in 4 years, she will be a much bigger player. And I think not just on the basis of her early election and identification as a sort of socialist, a left Democrat, but because she's gathering people around her, like-minded people around her. And so there's a lot of bad news in American politics, but I think this kind of collection of very, very progressive Democrats, people who aren't at all afraid of the kind of fundamental policy change Eileen was saying is needed. So she's the epicenter of that. And she might always be too much to the left to be a presidential candidate, but I think she's a player.
So I think it has something to do with whether she can, she already has a great following and is terribly charismatic, but whether she's able to step into Bernie's role, right? One of my kids insists that if Sanders had gotten the nomination 4 years ago, he would be president, right? And we do know that there are a significant number of people who voted for Obama, who voted for Bernie, who then voted for Trump, right? So it's whether that the populist energy, as I said, can be sort of channeled and directed in ways that we would appreciate.
Yeah. Very interesting question. Obviously, one of those hypotheticals, but one that people have been dwelling on over the last 4 years at various different stages. Lee Morrissey, who has Columbia affiliations, but also a Galway one, so a very nice participant to have, is asking an interesting question. He says that the vote looks much less coastal versus flyover than in 2016. It's now every city voting against its rural neighbors and vice versa. Can you talk about the new diffusiveness of the urban-rural tension? Is this good or just a measure of the depth of polarization? Yeah, that's a challenging question. I mean, I don't know, Eileen, if you have a view. I know you have upstate and downstate affiliations. That doesn't automatically mean you have direct contact with it, but just
no, I think it's always that the whole idea of the red state, blue state is really, it's been a coloring book problem, which is that it's always been rural and urban, right? I mean, I've said this, before publicly, that there are only 3 cities in the United States that vote, that over 100,000 people that vote Republican, and I think there only used to be 2. It was Provo, Utah, and Lubbock, Texas, and then they added in the last election Mesa, Arizona. So and as more people come to live in cities, right? yeah. So I think the urban divide, that's why the Democratic Party is getting, probably pushed, but anyway, is moving sort of center left because I think of the urban stuff, but which we might, somebody else might want to talk about it, but this is what makes the Electoral College such an issue at this moment in time, right? Is that if you live in California, for example, your vote is, if you live in South Dakota, your vote is worth 19 times more than your vote in California.
Yeah, that certainly does play havoc with the one person, one vote principle, no question. I was talking to a friend in Spain who made an interesting point about, what's the purpose of the Electoral College, which I was not very well able to explain. I mean, I have a kind of basic American civics class version of it, but not a sophisticated one. But he was pointing out, well, there's already a system in place for having 2 senators for small states. Why do you need this other protection, which I thought was an interesting observation. Moving on to other questions, there were a lot of things coming in. Elspeth Payne is asking, this is for Charlotte. You mentioned social media platforms. I wondered if the panel could talk more about the role of media in this election. And there's a fairly long commentary, but maybe just stop there to say, right, it obviously was a huge story last time. One could take it back to Obama's effectiveness in that territory. It's not as if that's an exclusive domain, but it's been certainly the particular area in which Trump has prospered, and his entire presidency has been run via Twitter, really. So, yeah, I don't know your thoughts, particularly on the context of the campaign. Charlotte, do you have any views about social media?
I mean, I think what has really changed between the way in which Obama captured the attention, used social media so effectively, is the funneling down a perspective of how people get their news, the kinds of campaign advertising that is coming across their desk. That is a really fundamental change between 2008 and now. I mean, I would also say, I remember when Trump got elected 4 years ago thinking like somebody's just going to have to take his phone away. No one's going to let a president act that way. But I think that in a way, his unfilteredness on social media, contributes to the continuance of that populist support. Because the idea, well, he's not hiding, he's speaking directly to us, even if it's not true. And, again, we've raised our kind of expectations or tolerance threshold again. And I don't know how that's going to play out if we're looking at a new administration going forward. But I think that these big corporate, that Google, that Facebook, they have a lot to answer for in terms of the way in which they're shaping the world landscape through the kinds of advertising practices they allow.
Yeah, thank you. There's again, various other questions we might, in the time we have, we should touch on. One is Sean Crossan is pointing out that I guess during our session that Trump has tweeted, all the recent Biden claimed states will be legally challenged by us for voter fraud and state election fraud. Plenty of proof. Just check out the media, apropos of what you were just saying, Charlotte. We will win America first. And could you please ask the panelists whether these legal challenges have any potential to succeed? I don't know, Stephanie, whether you have a view on that about I mean, there's obviously a kind of a variety of things going on there to delegitimize the election, destabilize it, then potentially be able to draw on those energies and angers that might be distilled. Do you think there's anything to it as a strategy?
Well, thanks for the update, because breaking news, your democracy's going down. In this case, actually, I think Democrats learned an enormous amount after 2000. And all the things Eileen said about the dirty pool that's going on, I don't discount any of them. I don't discount the physical massing in the streets. I don't discount any of it, double voting, whatever. But I will say that the Democratic Party has assembled a legal team in this election that has won the vast majority of the challenges, which mostly involve various kinds of voter suppression. So Democracy Docket, the guy who runs that, Mark Elias, at one point said there were 200 cases in the courts of that the Republicans had brought in various states. They're very, very attentive to all the places where you can enter and shut down the vote, and they will continue to do that. But I am a pessimist on this, but in this case, I do not think they will prevail. But I don't think that's the whole story. This is not necessarily and never has been about winning the cases as Trump, the litigious guy. It has never been for him necessary to win them. It's important to bring them, to muddy the waters, to gin up panic, to rouse his followers, and to make the possibility of fraud linger over the outcome. And in this case, he's probably looking towards his own future. Something I read this morning, I'm really curious to ask Charlotte on the social media thing. Apparently, over the last few days, he tweeted at one point, #Biden crying family, misspelling family with 2 I's, which this journalist claimed was on purpose because that way it evades Twitter blocks. Is that true? I mean, are there ways to game even Twitter? Because he's getting blocked right and left on Twitter in the last 3 days. So that's that. I'm just curious what Charlotte thinks about that. But I am not a Pollyanna, and I am worried about everything they try to do. But the vote count cases that they're bringing now, they won't win, I don't think. And they might, and the media has been very careful about projecting winners, except for Fox, interestingly. So I don't think those will actually win legally, but that doesn't mean they won't perform politically.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question from Eliza Zingazer, who's given the surprising amount of support for Trump despite his catastrophic handling of the pandemic. How do the speakers think the Democratic Party should adapt in the coming years? Well, that's a lot to contend with there. I mean, Josef, I wonder if I could ask you about this. It was interesting in the opening remarks that nobody drew attention to the pandemic, and that doesn't seem to have furnished, I guess, the blue wave that that could have been a basis for it. Yeah, what do you is that the right way to read it, do you think? Was there maybe a more successful strategy by Trump of saying, ignore it, I'll get you back to work, it's not such a big deal?
Yeah, there's a way in which the terrain has been shifted from some sort of evaluation of the facts, period, right? That whether that's his performance on the record, and he's, again, right, on a certain level, he's brilliant at doing this, right? He just puts his hand out there and all of a sudden we're looking where he's pointing rather than what's obviously going on. I don't know that actually is a sufficient explanation of it, but I think it also, right, I mean, the skills that brought him to office are ones that continue to serve him well. And part of that, I think, goes back to, what Stephanie was just saying, but also what Eileen said at the outset is right, winning or losing is not the point. It's in some ways just undermining, right, sort of what we tend to accept as legitimate authority, as flawed as that may be. Yeah.
We're running a little bit short on time, and there's lots of interesting questions that have come in, and I might just sort of mention them rather than us being able to devote all the time we would like to them. There's a question from Deirdre McCanela about fixed terms introduced in the Supreme Court positions. Well, a lot depends on what's going to go on in the Senate. So, I mean, sadly, that could be a very short, very short answer. It certainly doesn't look as if expanding the court has got much of a leg to stand on. I'm not convinced that would really go very far anyway, would be politically advisable. I do personally think that fixed terms would at least be some way of moving things forward that would seem like a more reasonable position and wasn't automatically gaming an outcome. Not that that isn't what we've been witnessing for the last 4 years. Emily Apter is saying, when did educated versus no degree become such an important political analysis category, echoing the rural metro coastal divide? And is that very articulation part of the left's problem? That's an interesting one. I don't know, Eileen, I wondered, because you're doing such interesting work with the Prisons Project, with people who've been enfranchised, disenfranchised, and you're working on education. I know it's not motivated it's not a politically campaigning thing, but yeah, what's your take on that, the educated versus no degree?
So I think it was an important distinction to make, because after 4 years ago, when the polls or the debriefing happened, they said that white women voted for Trump in larger numbers than not, right? But when you drill down a little bit, it was white women without college degrees who were married largely to white men who also didn't have college degrees were voting in large numbers for Trump. But amongst women with college educations or more, they were Clinton voters. So I think that the attack on the universities, I think it is a really useful distinction, not only because of that, but because the attack on the universities that has happened in this administration has been vicious, and it just doesn't stop. It's from everything from, you know, the lawsuits against affirmative action and against Harvard, and or what was it, the undercutting the tax exempt status that we have, right? Suddenly we had to pay, private universities had to pay taxes on the endowments to a certain, and it's just, or just what happened recently with Princeton. Princeton said that they were going to address structural racism, and they got hit with a lawsuit from the Department of Education for being, that they'd taken federal dollars because they weren't racist. And so then they wanted to pay back. I mean, it's just, yeah.
A lot of dimensions to that. We're running very short on time, but I did want to acknowledge some of the very interesting questions that have come in. Lindsay Reed is asking about any predictions about the future of the Electoral College. Okay, that's a huge topic and deserves its own sort of seminar on its own. Eric Bousted has an interesting point about what might the impacts be for conservative Irish Americans to be exposed more to Irish peasant class history. That's an extremely interesting idea. I mean, it raises lots of points. I mean, Europe has its own problems, for example, of disavowing immigration, where immigration saved various different European countries. So there's bad faith in lots of different contexts. Martin O'Donoghue is commenting on, I wonder what political languages the panelists think progressives can use to confront those on the right openly propagating conspiracies like QAnon. Yeah, Eileen, if I could come back to you on that, because you had a fantastic seminar that you held, and I know it's a part of a series, but really terrific seminar on QAnon. I mean, is there a particular language that's available?
I don't. No, I mean, I don't think we can fight it with language. I think it's trying to understand the phenomenon and its in its popularity is what's important. It wouldn't, it's a religion that's would not have gained any traction at all were it not for social media. And as somebody pointed out recently on one of the panels, and we're about to do another one actually in QAnon in Europe later this month, which I'll let you know about. I lost my train of thought. I lost my train of thought.
It's a question about ways of responding to.
Right. Sorry. So that it wouldn't, if without social media, there would not be there. This would not have been spread. As somebody pointed out last week, that if there hadn't been the pandemic, that the new group of adherents or people who are going onto the sites, and there are over 500 million hits to these sites. If there hadn't been a pandemic, they're like yoga moms, stay-at-home moms, anti-vaxxers. These people who are sort of, because they're not mingling, we're all in our bubbles. And that word is, we should, understand all the ramifications of that word. I think it's you can't talk people out of it. It's a belief. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, they'll sort of admit it doesn't make any sense. The one other thing about it, what somebody pointed out, is that when you're basically on a screen, you don't have any real interaction with anybody else. The gaming quality of QAnon is really interesting to people, which is that they say it becomes addictive. You're looking for drops. It's drops, right? And that the structure of it apparently is very much modeled on things like Star Wars, actually, is what somebody.
That's extremely interesting. Yeah, please do let us know about that webinar, because I think this is very important, and important that knowing that it's also a European phenomenon as well. Stephanie, we're going to end shortly, but I did, and as I had mentioned yesterday when we were talking, I did want to ask you about Canada because of you have experience both in Northern Ireland, which we could also talk about as a weird parallel. But I'm thinking about Canada because of its. I mean, Mexico is always discounted in North America as an alternative to anything in the United States, but Canada is slightly different. It does obviously have a parliamentary system. And occasionally, partly because I was an undergraduate in Montreal, I think, yeah, what would it be like to have a Canadian system? At least it would mean that the individual governing had the legislature aligned with them, and there was some potential of bringing a legislative program forward. But I just wondered if you might indulge me a little bit by talking perhaps a little bit, maybe from a Canadian point of view or the Canadian system. I know that just Parliament has been prorogued, so that slightly nullifies my argument about how brilliant Canada is, but that's another matter.
Well, I mean, I'm not really a great candidate for that because I grew up in Belfast where I was already completely captured by the question of political division, right? And then I moved to Canada, which at that point, I got interested in Watergate, which was what was on the radio on the streets of Toronto in the mid 70s or 72, 73 when I first moved there. So I always found Canadian politics completely boring and I never paid any attention, and I still don't pay that much attention. And I think that in a way is its own answer. It's just very ill-suited as a comparison to US politics. I mean, when I think about, most of my siblings still live there. And when I think about what goes on in Canada and what they get worked up about, it just looks like, very reasonable things. They're fighting over reasonable things compared to here. And it's impossible to imagine the United States in any kind of parliamentary system. And Canada is just so small, not in land mass, but in population. I used to have these arguments with my father all the time because he was, this Falls Road guy, okay? But he got dropped in the middle of Toronto. And to the extent that he understood anything, he would just rage against American politics to me. How can they do that? How can you have no health insurance for people? How can people justify X, Y, and Z? So the lack of a social welfare net mostly. He couldn't understand it. And it was this sort of sense of decency about one human being to another. You don't let people starve. You don't let their children go cold. You don't, what the hell kind of a government is that? And all his solutions were so implausible for the United States because fiscally, Canada is such a different operation than the United States. And the tax burden, like in Canada, as you know, Dan, if you're a renter, you get a tax credit, not a homeowner. So it's another world, and they're impacted greatly by the craziness down here. But it just feels like a very small, reasonable, decent world. And when my mother was very sick, and I spent a lot of time in Toronto over the last couple of years, it was absolutely a revelation to be in the hospitals because the doctors are all 25 years old. They're all really young. They don't have huge debt from medical school, and they're immigrants or the children of immigrants. And they get their medical degree and they go to work for $100,000 a year, and that's it. They're not making $700,000 a year. They're not carrying massive liability insurance. They don't need to be a specialist. It's just another world for immigrant. The joke is the American dream's alive and well in Canada. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
That's a very good
politics is not urgent enough for me.
Yeah.
I think I maybe got an addictive charge in Belfast, and that was the end of me for any kind of normal politics. But it's a very reasonable place.
Yeah, I think Eileen, you might have.
I just want to say Dickens actually said that in 1842.
Really?
He came to the United States thinking it was going to be the American dream, was quickly, turned off, went to Canada, and basically said the same thing.
Yeah. I have a final question, if I may. I wanted to direct to Josef and actually also to Charlotte. And we haven't talked so much about grievance politics, and we've talked about forms of grievance politics. And I just wonder, okay, let's say for the sake of argument that Biden is elected. I mean, it seems not implausible at the moment. What happens to grievance politics? Are we really left with it? Is that going to be the state of play? I mean, Biden's obviously made different kinds of appeals. What's your prognostication, I guess, if I could ask you? Josef, yeah, I was going to ask you that.
And I think this is in some ways the one way Trump truly is an evangelical, right? Right? That is, I could be martyr of the most privileged class, but I am going to position myself of embattled, and I'm going to galvanize a whole bunch of energy. So my sense is that strategy will live on, irrespective of how the next couple of days play itself out.
Yeah, there was a question that had come through from Claire Walsh about what happens.
And I think
next for
on
Donald
that
Trump.
as well, something we haven't talked about is, campaign money, campaign spending, how I think the figure that we have spent on this presidential election, I think I heard was $14 billion, which could not that money be directed towards something better in terms of economic stimulus to get the country out of the coronavirus hole? We've seen the way in which the reshuffling of the Supreme Court and conservative interests on there have led to less strings being tied to corporate campaign donation and all that, and I think as well, the more money we spend on elections, the more that grievance politics has been legitimized by Donald Trump. We're creating, again, that perfect storm, along with the funneling of the perspective that is coming into your news, coming into your social media. I think we'll see another Trump, even if we manage to get rid of him, maybe literally another Trump from his own family, or who knows. But we keep raising the stakes in terms of money and allowing, and again, raising those tolerance levels. So I think we're stuck for the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, I have no idea what Baron Trump's politics are, but I mean, 50 years from now, he could be alive and well and up to all sorts. We should stop there. I think it's probably only fair that we ran long, given the nature of the election at the moment. We've had a 72-hour day, as Josef was describing it earlier. I think that was very apt. Thank you very much. It's really been a terrific discussion and very interesting. And thanks for taking the time in the midst of all the other things that are going on. So thanks again to all the colleagues, and
Thank you, Dan.
look forward to further interaction. Yeah, take care.
All right.
See you then.